I'm wondering, I'm sort of mindful of our time, and I'm wondering, Brian, if we want to transition into a conversation of the month by month. Is it a good time to do that?
It is.
Um, and while we're doing that, I made a mental note to circle back to a comment that Jacques made that I want to just echo, reflect back, and offer my appreciation for. I think perhaps there's no greater compliment than for someone to call you a learner. And I heard that in your comments, and I really appreciate that. I think it's crazy that tears just came to my eyes and making this reflection back, Jacques. But what I've come to learn a few years back when I turned 50 is all that I thought I had learned, I know very, very little. And isn't that aging, right? The more you age, the more you realize how little you know. So I do feel like in the last many years, and much of what is encapsulated in this book is new learning or reimagined learning that was about changing at a DNA level who I am in the world, while also maintaining sort of my poppiness. And I think we can all appreciate that, right? How do we stay who we are and learn and grow through topics that are contentious and difficult, as the title reflects? I think what was magical here was a collection of voices that had particular expertise in various areas. And so, for example, I definitely am a strengths focused leader and have been throughout my career. And so I think January, February, March, leading through the storm, navigating collective trauma, uncertainty, change, and rights is a session that I'm really excited to take the lead on presenting on. Pronouns and LGBTQ plus rights. Brian and I and Jacques will join hands to lead on. I want to be a student of the January session on firearms, right? I think there's probably opportunity for me to continue learning there. So I think that's the beauty of these sessions, the chapters in the book. Same again, I look at talking about cancel culture, and I feel like I can feel myself needing to learn and grow in that area a little bit more. And so it was very fun, I think, to be an author and watching other people express their expertise and their scholarship around these various topics. Interestingly enough, and I just want to take a moment to say, writing about difficult subjects across diverse people is, as you might imagine, as challenging as talking about difficult topics. And so I still sit with a bit of discomfort on the title of our talking about Black Lives Matter, Black all in blue, talking about which lives matter. I'm not sure that that's how I would phrase that subject. And I don't know why I'm a little uncomfortable with it, but I am. And so I really think that is a good real life example of how this diverse group of people came together to create something around which there isn't universal agreement. And I can't remember who earlier was talking about language, and it was Brian talking about the various coasts and how people use language and approach. This is the most terrifying and thrilling part of the production of a work that takes on some of these topics, is the notion that you're leaning in. Perhaps we'll have lots of opportunities to say thank you to folks who give us feedback, right? Mm-hmm. And that it's okay that we're all not of a single mind or view. And of course we aren't. And thank you, Jacques. I appreciate the applause there. And jump in.
So can I say something, Poppy? I love that you went there, and I love that because what we talk about often in the emotional intelligence space, that agreement absolutely is not required. And isn't this interesting, Poppy and Brian and Tim? Because in the academy, with faculty, at least the narrative is, if we're not agreeing, then there's something dysfunctionally improper about how we're moving. And so that's why we say throw agreement out the window. It's all about alignment. Alignment is recognition that we have different perspectives and different opinions, and we're coming together for the purpose of moving the organization forward with all of those perspectives in tow. And so that's why when folks get this feeling, there's this somatic feedback that their body is giving them about, hey, I'm not comfortable in this space. I think that's a good time to lean into it. Own your discomfort. Let's just have a good time in that, because it's okay. We often say it's okay not to be okay. It's okay when we feel discomfort. It's okay when there's that unease, because to me, that indicates there's a growth opportunity or a new level of awareness that we get to sit with however long it takes, right? And so often in this 20th and 21st century microwave generation, you just want to press a button and you all want it done. And I think that's the beauty about the book. The beauty about the book is after we give folks the tools, there is and now you got to sit with it. And now it may be a wonderful experience. It may be discomforting. It may be unease, and that's okay, because let's recognize folks who are giving us feedback about their own lived experiences that may not be reflective of what we hear from mainstream media and that socialization process. Let's recognize that those people are living with a lot of discomfort. Even as folks are talking about, like the feedback I got, circle the wagons. Let's recognize that to Indigenous folks, that ain't a good feeling either. You know, that and for those of us who grew up watching, oh, I don't know, Gunsmoke or Bonanza or Big Valley, and how the West was portrayed, and the lived experience of so many folks who were of that time and that's not what their experience was. When we look at the government policy of the United States as it related to how we connected and how we engaged with Indigenous folks, the policy of containment, of management, which is a nice way of saying control and genocide, existed from the 1800s until 1980. And when you let that land, that the United States and Nazi Germany had the same racial purity outlook. In fact, the racial purity laws of Nazi Germany came from the United States. And yet we're fighting a war to make it safe for democracy, is what we told folks. We'll tell that to Indigenous populations here. That as we're liberating concentration camps, what are we doing to our own Indigenous communities? So it is very uncomfortable. And it leads to a new level of awareness and understanding. And that's why I love Poppy. I think the best place to be is as a student, because it's a safe place, because we can learn and grow when we can really default to that cultural humility. Of course, I don't know everything that I don't know. And I'm learning and growing, and that's why we're on this journey collectively. But I think that's the beauty of this. And whenever we get into this absolutism position that we know all there is to know, and everybody gets to do it this way, as opposed to all the other ways that possibly exist for us, that's when I feel that we get into trouble. So I'm so grateful that you called that forth, because it's not just the tools, it's not just the exercises, it's also the way of being. And Brian, for you and Poppy and Tammy, I think that their conversations probably are what's next conversation when we're done exploring the tools. Because if you have the tools and don't have the proper way of being, then there's going to be a gap there. Poppy, you mentioned the whole strength builders perspective, but the gap is its tools and ways of being and language and all the things together that really set us up for that beautiful transformative experience. If we don't have all of those, I feel that we miss.
I know, I was just preach. Agree. Yeah.
So good. Yeah, it's a good conversation. It's to take it a little meta. I'll try to only say that once every program, but like for those who are learning how to engage students or faculty and staff on this, I personally think the challenge is how do we get caught up in our passion as we're teaching and talking, and we aren't running everything through a filter. How do we strike that balance? Because we don't want to be in a place where it is so, I know, Jacques, you're not a fan of this phrase, like the politically correct, right? We become so restrictive in what we can say. Yet there's times where I think the educational piece needs to occur, especially at an early stage. I get emails every week from this company, and bless their hearts, they're a suicide prevention company, and they've named themselves Every Life Matters. And I'm like, bad timing, guys. Like, it's just, and I don't know how they pull out of that
Oh,
spin.
that's a thing. Like, really?
It
Wow.
it is, and I would almost guarantee that it was workshopped in like 2017. And it just, they all decided they bought a logo. I don't know. I'm sure they get emails on the daily from it, but like there's times where we bring it into the light is important, having the conversation about it. If I was working at that company, part of my role would be like, I mean, changing the logo would need to be an important part of it because it's just, it hits a certain way. But it's that intent versus impact conversation. And I think the problem we see in society, and Jacques, this tags back, I think, to the crucial conversations that we've had before in that space and emotional intelligence. A lot of this falls back to the assumed ill intent, and where we react rather than question and engage. And that's important, although I still struggle with it. Usually when I'm talking with Tammy, who's pissed as hell about some major injustice that's happening, and she should be pissed as hell, it's that strike between, is this an educational opportunity or an expression of revolution? Like, and that I think is at the heart of some of the things that we wrestle with in this book. Like, what's educational and what's, that's not a valid point. Like, you can't put on a robe and go burn things on people's lawns. Like, that's, there's no like, well, let's just agree to disagree on that. But how do we address that? How do we address the precursor pieces to it? That's probably a little deep for today, I suppose.
Right. And so it's a recognition, Brian, that actions have consequences, right?
Yeah.
And we often say, yes, you're free to think and express yourself, and actions have consequences. So if I'm expressing myself to the demise of others, where I'm creating hurt, where I'm creating harm, we get to comment on that. And if that harm rises to a legal harm or legal wrong, then there's redress. I mean, we see that in the announcement today. Yes, individuals. And I think today, for me, represented a win for democracy. We hear that folks who have means and wealth get to avoid that accountability. And what happened today with the district attorney's announcement of charges being filed against the 18 is an acknowledgement that we are each accountable for our actions and our conduct. And it's going to require, now they've got to go through a jury of their peers to determine of course, they're innocent until proven guilty, presumed innocent until proven guilty, and must go through that process. And so I think it's a win for democracy. And I think it's even interesting how folks are reporting that, when we're hearing certain media outlets reporting that, other media outlets reporting other things. But then actions always have consequences. And I think that this is a wonderful reminder of that no person should be above the law. And we shouldn't want people to be above the law. I think that's very disturbing for me when I hear pundits want to excuse the conduct or behavior. We haven't excused them for other folks, so why should we do that here?
Well, and Jock, I just want to add, like, I love, no one's above the law, but like, I guess I just struggle because I'm from Wisconsin, and I think of Kyle Rittenhouse, who came from outside of the state. We had just had an African American shot as he was held by his T-shirt in the back several times by a police officer with the children in the car. And Kyle Rittenhouse decides, from Illinois, that he's 17 and he's going to come across state lines and he's going to protect property that does not belong to him. And that was the whole cursor for him coming. And then he ended up killing and really wounding, critically wounding, two allies who were out there, European Americans, marching, saying, hey, this is the over policing, these disparities, they need to stop. We see exactly what's happening. And then to see Kyle Rittenhouse paraded around as a hero and see bail collected for him an astronomical amount. To me, that is just so like it's amazing. It's awful that like to say, oh wow, it's okay, you killed some people, and that's okay though, because you did it for the right reason. You had no business there. Yeah, that was not your property to protect. But just the assumption associated with I need to be there because I'm going to stand on this side of the political line, and I'm going to. It's just like wow. Or to think of, I think of George Zimmerman. He was auctioning off the gun that he used to kill Trayvon Martin. They used to have him at gun shows in Florida signing autographs. So just the whole political ideology of that even being okay, it is amazing to me. So with you, I'm glad to see really people begin to be held accountable for what they actually do. But it automatically went to Kyle Rittenhouse, who was acquitted, which I just could not believe. Right. No. I mean, after what, again, you crossed state lines, like there was no reason for you to be there. So I just wanted to add that in.
Because as I'm speaking aspirationally, I know the lived experience of so many folks is very different and not in alignment with my aspirations. And so I still get to hold on to that and acknowledge, yeah, for a lot of folks, as you so eloquent, and we could, if we had 5 minutes, we could probably go through 20, 30, 40 different examples of where folks were not held accountable. I think Poppy and I talk about, I tend to believe in karma. So I ultimately believe that karma deities end up working everything out, and there's still work to do in terms of making sure that everyone is, and that goes back to that whole concept of a meritocracy that we were talking about, the myth of the meritocracy, because it is a myth, and yet another reason that academic institutions really need this tool and so many more like it. Let's acknowledge that, folks. I think this is a wonderful tool, and academia needs about 50 more like it, right? Because we've got a lot of challenges that we get to unpack. So I'm grateful that we provided a valuable resource for faculty and administrators, classified leaders, parents, and there get to be more. Absolutely.
And I just want to do just a quick, well, not a plug, but just to say that it's sad because in the state of Florida, this book can never be used in higher ed. So in the state of Florida, our governor has pulled all diversity, equity, and inclusion funding as well as physicians. And so any books, we have book bans going on right now. So Maya Angelou is banned. Quite a few books. So yes, they are going through them. They are vetting which ones. And I know that this book, unless it's a private university, will never be able to engage.
We get this vetted, Tammy? I want to vet it.
I mean,
fail on every single chapter.
Yeah, because the state of Florida, this will never be taught. But I also have to say that our governor in the state of Florida also wrote a book, and he talks about race and gender identity. And guess what? His book should never be taught either, because it goes beyond that scope of what he said. So if his book is ever discussed in higher ed, I'll definitely be reaching out to let them inform them of ours, since his goes against the grain of what he established in regards to the books being banned.
A goose and gander situation, I believe. Talked about some of these concepts already. I mean, we'll work them into the recording, but we're starting in September about cancel culture is one of our chapters here, and I'll just kind of go slowly. If anyone wants to jump in on these, just go for it.
So cancel culture really is something that began with Black Twitter. And I wrote a lot about this. And it was basically a way for us to share our experiences or express ourselves or call out the Karens and Kens that we've seen in society who are so busy trying to police our bodies and not having that media coverage because we don't control that outlet. And so cancel culture is really a tool for social justice, as it allows us to call out certain things and recognize, like our Indigenous sisters when they're missing, the lack of media attention and things of that. So it's really about free speech and giving a voice to the often voiceless.
I think the big hitch in this one for me around cancel culture, which I tried to take not a counterpoint, but maybe a little more detail on, what happens when someone's failed short of good and how do they dig themselves out of the hole that they've gotten themselves into. And I very much appreciate Jacques' comments about natural consequences, and I think those are reasonable. Is there a path to redemption? And that'll be, I think, a really good conversation in that particular program. Some of those issues.
So we're starting to do, and Brian, you're aware, you and Tammy are aware of the work that we're doing at CPS with respect to giving training for elected officials. And so we lead with civility. We lead with the art of governance is all about the art of alignment. And so recognizing the humanity in everyone. And the other thing is, again, for all of it, and all of us are history nerds, we know the reality versus the perception. And here's what I mean. Politics has always been about sausage making. It's never been kind. And so I think the open civility, what folks saw versus what went on behind closed doors, that conduct has always been wild and crazy, right? And so, and when you read a lot, I mean, even looking at reading all of the different treatises and narratives about just how Lincoln was able to pass the 13, 14, 15 amendments, all the political machinations behind Lincoln running for president, being anti-slavery and also anti-Black. He ran on both platforms, anti-slavery and anti-Black. So again, that kind of disrupts that American mythology that here's grand old Mr. Lincoln out of his magnanimous worldview who wanted to liberate us, and gone to the Lincoln Memorial. It's a beautiful thing. And I acknowledge Lincoln for being the leader that he was, but it's far more complicated than what the mythology of our education system acknowledges. That one of the options, let's emancipate Africans and export them to Costa Rica. And even in saying that, like, we're just going to move them over here because we know that with the Monroe Doctrine, the United States had hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. So of course we could move them to another country that's not ours. So there's a lot to unpack there. But again, just the need of we get to be more human. And so that's what this chapter really explores and examines. I loved reading again, as a student, I loved reading this chapter. I think there's an awful lot of learning that gets to go here. And a lot of the work that we do at CPS, we guide a lot of our elected officials reading this chapter because there's some wonderful learning awarenesses that come from it.
So certainly, as I reflect back on my years in higher education, always my positions have involved the support and advocacy for and with students with disabilities. And I think when we first were talking about the outline for the book, there wasn't a chapter that focused on disability, ableism, and accessibility. And it felt really important to me to ensure that it was added there. And particularly, as we mentioned earlier, because of this notion that we're learning more and more and more about of intersectionality and that impacts that multiple identities have on individuals as they navigate educational spaces. So I could go on and on and on, and I will when we get to this session. But suffice to say, many of the topics that we're talking about are difficult conversations for different kinds of reasons. Disability is a particularly interesting topic of conversation because we have such an interesting view socially, culturally, disability through a deficit lens. And so I think really reframing some of that and exploring some new and evolving language around disability, and then getting some very practical tools and resources regarding accessibility practices within our work will be part of what we'll do in this session.
The gun control one as well here was a passion project for me in terms of looking at accessibility to weapons, how that relates to threat and violence. It's also a big hot button issue on college campuses in terms of carry and concealed carry. how that plays out. And, you know, one of the challenges of the book, I think, throughout is the topicalness, I suppose, of the issues and how they sort of come and go. And, you know, this one has been, you know, fairly perennial, but maybe has faded a little bit with some of the other crisis issues that are going on. But understanding, again, through a process of identifying the pros and cons of both sides of the argument in terms of access, in terms of restriction, being able to have, I think, a healthy dialogue and debate on the topic rather than the shouting back and forth of talking points, which I think we all can agree is not the best approach here. This was a chapter too, and one of the things we included with today's program was a handout, and we'll continue to do that on different topics. So we included a handout on emotional intelligence. I think this was a pause point for us as we got into some pretty heated issues in the beginning of our series, wanting to talk about how to address triggering events, things, language, how all these things can escalate. So this one will be a little bit more educational around some techniques and tools around keeping that general heat down as we're having the conversations.
Yeah, I think it came perhaps later in the evolution of the book and the publication of the book, simply by virtue of the benefits that we get out of reflecting backwards on experience and recognizing this kind of universal experience that the leaders around me were sharing, certainly those that I was experiencing, what was an unprecedented experience of the pandemic, and then whatever the return to normal is. And I use those words very gingerly, return to some way of post-pandemic normalcy, really recognizing that those impacts very much are still with us. And Jacques, I especially am thinking about you in the HR space and really recognizing how significantly we are having conversations about supervision, management, leadership of folks who are still wounded, both practically, actual loss of human life, and emotionally by virtue of the experience, and what that looks like when they come to work or don't. And so it's hard, I think, to summarize this particular session in 3 sentences or less, but I would just say it was, for me, the reflection backwards on these past several years that guided, I think, a need for us to include this session in the context of this series.
You know, this issue touches, and I probably have the same trouble you do with this title that maybe you had with the other title, Poppy. Like, for me, one of my worries is that it brings together the idea of pronoun usage, which is really more about gender identity and expression and sexual orientation. Leave it as a learning point, I suppose we get to do that. But in terms of this population, this group, violence that's occurred against the trans community, families being split because of some of these conversations are massive. And the idea that they're not going to trickle over into classroom conversations, or a well-meaning faculty, you know, will say, "How was Thanksgiving?" and then kind of get into this space. It goes back to the beginning of, I'd really like that well-meaning faculty to have read this chapter so that they're a little bit more prepared, and they can very quickly say, "Oh, well, I've learned sexual orientation is not the same as gender expression, and we should pay attention to that." And those things, I think, are helpful in this space as well. This is a website that we put together on this topic for folks to look at, and we'll make sure that that's available. But just if you're new to this topic and some of the issues of pronoun use in the workplace and at college, this is a great place that we steer folks.
Yes, very, very happy to. I think it's quite possible that there are few lightning rod topics, politically motivated, really engaging in some conversation around the topic of abortion as a healthcare right, and exploring some of the history, the topic of abortion in the United States and how it's evolved over time, and an exploration of how it is that abortion has become, as a topic, such a politically and socially charged topic. And then just to say, I'm constantly thinking about, through the lens of what loss of right is likely to impact, or how it's likely to impact young people, women, non-gender conforming folks in the context of their educational pursuits. So I think really tying the topic of abortion rights to the higher ed experience and really recognizing that these are not two distinct topics, but in fact, they really will have the likelihood of impacting how folks are pursuing higher education and the kinds of experiences they have there. And for all kinds of different reasons that, again, I won't get into now, but we'll talk more about during that session.
Defund the police. This is a challenging issue that I think there's been a slight shift in the politics of this from when we started the book to where we are now. And my take on it is that we're really looking at the transparency and the working with police on these issues more than the complete defunding of this. I think there's still some large issues here related to the over investment. It's probably a national issue, I would say, in terms of what we spend on war and military and policing versus what we spend in other areas that are much more preventative and health driven. But I do think that working with and having conversations with has been a big part of the work that I've been involved in the DPrep space. It's not easy. I don't often agree, and it's a challenge, but I do think getting into some of the details here is an important topic, and one that really is going to be best handled through conversation and challenge rather than the pairing off and the separating here. And I think this is another great place for allyship in this space as well.
I love this topic. Again, we're a nation of immigrants, some of us voluntary, others forced. Let's recognize that there was an indigenous population here of over 18 to 20 million people. That population has been decimated but the influx of immigration, and really finding a way to talk about how humans have been migrating as a species for 70,000 years, right? And so a lot of times when we look at immigration, a lot of times we look at immigration through the lens of these very nationalistic and very limited scope and perspectives. But when you broaden that and look at the human experience, recognizing that humans have been the dominant species on the planet for the last 70,000 years, and humans have always migrated, and there have always been implications to that migration. I think when you look at it from that context, I think it's easier to understand the lived experience of folks who have migrated to the United States, and understanding that our country did not treat all folks who migrated here in the same way. There was direct government policy against many folks, from the Chinese Exclusion Act to the Bracero program and that these conversations that we are having didn't just start in 2016 or in 1980 with Ronald Reagan and immigration reform. Let's recognize that immigration and how we've dealt with immigration has been a narrative and theme since the country's inception.
This brings us to the last topic, which is just going to bring it all together, which is for us a chance to look at the idea of what's changed since we began in the program and how this is playing out, and a chance to revisit any of the topics that needed revisiting. And I think that conversation is an important one.
I like the idea, Brian, too, of that bringing it all together session, setting a context for us as authors and presenters to also reflect some of what we've learned from the participants over the course of the months ahead of us. So not just what's changed broadly on a particular topic, but also what we've gleaned and learned from the folks that we're engaging with over the course of these months.
I think this was a good starting place. As we pull it together, we will pull it together into a piece. I think the future sessions will look a little different in that they'll be a little more focused and conversational on topics and engaging with some of the audience members. But for this first one, we really wanted to give you an overview of where we were and where we're headed. So before we close out, any final thoughts, either Jacques or Poppy?
I'm excited to be on this journey. For those of you who are joining us, we promise you it's going to be an incredibly growth, learning experience. Expect the unexpected. Get prepared to really dive deep with us as we navigate many of these really important issues. What do you think, Poppy?
Ditto, Jacques. Brian, thank you so much for your leadership of this effort, and I'm in agreement. I'm really looking forward to joining. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.